Hello, I'm Selina Downes and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing the United States right now. President Trump has been trying to sell the Iran war to the American public, but are they buying it? As oil and gas prices surge, the world's attention is fixed on the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water thousands of miles from the White House. But the decisions being made here are reverberating across the global economy. Coming up, I speak with retired Vice Admiral John Miller, the former head of U.S. naval forces, about whether growing conflicts are stretching American military resources.
We do need a bigger Navy in order to be able to be more flexible for these kinds of activities.
But first, we hear from Americans about how quickly the war in Iran is hitting their wallets here at home. For many Americans, the Strait of Hormuz is a long way away, but inflation is at its highest level in 2 years, and for many we spoke to, it is having an immediate impact on their wallets, especially those with young families.
Everything, fuel, gas, groceries, products, anything you buy. It all runs on diesel fuel. You go, you get 4 bags of groceries and it's $400.
While some regions are being hit harder, no one is escaping rising fuel costs. A gallon of petrol that cost $2.94 in February jumped to $4.15 in early April. It's the largest monthly hike in 6 decades. The cost of jet fuel has also soared. Major airlines like Delta and American say their fuel costs this quarter will rise by more than $2 billion. Passengers are already paying the price through higher fares and added fees. And it doesn't stop at the pump. Transporting food has become more expensive. Most of America's produce is shipped by road. Some Americans are facing difficult choices.
Things are so expensive now in the markets. Foodstuffs are expensive. In fact, I don't really know how to go about it. Right now, most people are making window shopping. If we commoners cannot afford foodstuffs.
How are you managing?
With the help of friends, I'm managing.
The economic strain associated with the war is posing a challenge for the president, who vowed to bring prices down. Now the White House is trying to sell a new message to Americans.
Short-term pain for the long-term gain.
Short-term pain be for long-term gain.
We're going to have some short-term pain with long-term gain.
We have to focus on the short-term.
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 Short-term and long-term.
Short-term.
At the regular White House press briefing, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made a rare appearance to talk up the economy after the IMF said a global recession would be a close call.
I'm optimistic that during the summer we will see gas with a 3 in front of it sooner rather than later. So I've been meeting with a lot of my Middle Eastern counterparts, the finance ministers, and they all say that once the straits are open, they can start pumping again.
But even if supply resumes, relief won't be immediate. For now, many Americans are adjusting their lives to keep up with their bills. Edgar Ibarra runs a small street business and has a wife and a mother to support. He says they're all making financial sacrifices.
I used to go to shop a lot, I like to buy clothes, shoes. I don't do that anymore, I'd rather keep what I have, and just try to spend my money on things that I really need, like food, gas, things like that.
In Washington, the trade-offs are getting clearer. Healthcare, food assistance and basic services, all programs that millions depend on, are all on the chopping block as Congress debates how to pay for the war. So, as the costs mount from global conflict to everyday life, the question isn't just what's happening to the economy, but how much Americans are willing to absorb before they demand a change. We are in a year of midterms, after all. Joining me to discuss all of this are the Democratic strategist Michael Hardaway, who was a former aide for President Barack Obama, and Patrick Mara, the chairman of the Washington, D.C. Republican Party. Welcome to you both. President Trump says the war has been a total victory.
For the US, the war goals have been achieved. Americans will have to endure some economic pain for the long-term gain in order to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. Michael, is that a worthwhile trade-off?
Let's be honest here, all right? All of this is nonsense. This war is costing us $1 billion a day. The American public, in an overwhelming capacity, oppose this war. 53% of Americans oppose it. And so Donald Trump started this war. He didn't bother to go before Congress and convince them of the necessity of it, nor the American public. And the reality is that if he didn't withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that President Obama enacted 10 years ago, we wouldn't be here. Because that is the very deal that essentially disarmed any nuclear capabilities that Iran had. 97% of its enrichment was going away, and that was going to be verified by the IAEA. That would have been a perfect situation.
Patrick, national debt, $39 trillion. The president had a nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, that a lot of people say it wasn't perfect, but it was a deal nonetheless. And now we're seeing a crisis here at home with oil and gas prices rising. Is there a strategy here?
So a lot of people agreed with the nuclear deal, but a lot of people disagreed with the nuclear deal because the nuclear deal did allow for the gradual growth of nuclear material once the time expired. And in this instance, what you see here is President Trump going after enriched uranium, going after nuclear material, but also going after these offensive ballistic missiles, going after these drones. 90% of that capability has been wiped out. What people neglect to say is that, look, they've been the Iranian regime has been the world's leading terrorist actor for 47 years. The Iranian regime killed tens of thousands, according to human rights groups, tens of thousands of its own civilian population in January. And so this is legitimately an evil regime. So President Trump did topple most of the regime. It's unclear of who's in control now. But look, the nuclear material, as part of the whatever agreement they are able to make, they need to have some conclusion to that. And in ending, in not allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons, does that mean it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? But there needs to be some agreement in place with nuclear. And then obviously we now need the Strait reopened. And so in this instance, you do have the U.S. with a bit of a barricade there. And what you see is, an Iranian government that is suffering pretty bad economic hardship, which is why they're very upset about this. And approximately 500 million a day in economic losses, and that really is unsustainable for the Iranian government.
One of the criticisms has been there's been mixed messaging. Was it about liberating Iranians from the Iranian government? Was it about the nuclear enrichment? Was it about ballistic missiles?
He doesn't know the answer to that question. I don't mean to cut you.
Yeah, sorry.
He doesn't know the answer to that question, right? And I don't think, as Americans, or really any country, I don't think it's legal nor viable to invade any country because you decide they're bad guys. Yes, they're bad guys. That's half the world. I mean, there's been a genocide in the Sudan for years, right? The DRC and the Congo. We could go around the world and have this conversation. If we're saying these are bad guys, you could check half the countries in the world off that list. So that's the first thing. Second thing I want to say, and the last thing I'll say here, is that, look, there is no plan here, right? If we're saying we wanted to protect women or civilians, well, the U.S. has killed hundreds of them, right? And so I don't really know what the plan is. I don't think anyone knows what the plan is. But at $1 billion a day, can we really afford this conversation?
I mean, if we take a look at some of the figures, President Trump is saying that he's going to go to Congress potentially to ask for an extra $200 billion in additional war funding. If we just have a look at the Institute of Policy Studies, they've done a cost analysis of what that $200 billion could fund. It could cover Medicaid or affordable health insurance for 14 million Americans and expand it to a further 10.3 million people, and also cover food assistance for 4 million people. Patrick, is it a tough sell to tell Americans who might not be able to afford health care that they're going to have to pay out for an extra $200 billion to fund the war?
I don't think that's a tough sell to not have, to preventing Iran from having nuclear materials. Because look, I mean, you even saw, they've been firing drones and missiles at their Gulf neighbors, their Muslim Gulf neighbors, and they give them a nuclear weapon, and who would they fire that at?
Michael, I hear this from a few people that we've interviewed for this program, that Iran may not have been an imminent threat, but they're a constant threat to U.S. security.
It's nonsense. Because again, remember, their uranium enrichment was 3%. That's a civilian level. That's the first thing. The second thing is, the United States was unprepared for something they should have known was going to happen. This time last year, the Director of National Intelligence released a report, its annual threat assessment. And in that threat assessment, in the Section 4 Iran, it said, if attacked, Iran would do two things. It would attack its neighbors, which we've seen, and it would close the Strait of Hormuz, which we've seen. These are things that the Trump administration said publicly would happen. So then it happens, and there's no preparation for that. 20% of the world's oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz. That's problematic, obviously, for gas prices, but also all the things that are made with plastic.
And look, 90% of the oil goes to China, right? And so I think what President Trump believed and what he still believes is that other world powers will get engaged in this process to help open up the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, I mean, you mentioned gas prices. President Trump did promise to end all wars, and he promised to make life more affordable for Americans. He made a specific campaign pledge to get petrol prices below $2 a gallon. The national average is currently around $4 a gallon, but it's much higher on the West Coast. It's around $5 a gallon. So no wars and cheaper fuel. Neither of those campaign pledges have materialized.
Yeah, admittedly, the gas issue will be an issue, which I will not disagree with my colleague on. And this will be an issue at least through the summer, possibly into the fall elections. The pain point of the fall election starts with early voting and September, October, but we still are a ways away. And so, in all honesty, President Trump will need to make this up in other ways if he's not able to bring gas prices down.
I mean, we saw him, he traveled to Nevada, he was talking up no tax on tips, tax rebates for millions of Americans. We saw that staged managed stunt at the White House where he had burgers delivered to the White House,
yes.
To reinforce the message that millions of Americans will benefit from some of these other policies.
And the economic metrics at this point are holding on, but the issue becomes, will they be able to hold through the summer? And I mean, this really does become an issue because more Americans travel in the summer months. Americans love their vehicles.
But that's not even his biggest problem.
Potentially haven't seen the fallout.
I don't even think the gas prices being high are always a problem. But that's not his biggest problem. I think his biggest problem is there's been an economic massacre on his watch over the past year. Inflation, in which part he was elected to fix, is higher today than it was on election day in 2024. You've got roughly 20 million Americans that have lost health care because of the tax bill that he passed last year and the expiration of the tax credits that he allowed to happen late last year. That's what's going to sink Republicans in November. We saw this in 2018.
Trump's approval ratings have dropped to their lowest level in recent days. We have a graphic, I think, that can show that his approval remains at around 36%. 62% disapprove of him and this war.
Well, Democrat approval ratings are even lower. But with regard to President Trump, I mean, this is why he needs to end the conflict as expeditiously as possible.
So do you think it's the messaging? Where is it going wrong? Where is it breaking down?
Look, President Trump, the way he speaks in very extreme terms. I think we all we can all admit that. And I think in the first term, right, I think many Americans did not understand what he was saying. Interesting enough, a lot more understand President Trump now than they did before.
U.S. intelligence suggests Iran still has roughly 60% of its missile capabilities and a significant drone arsenal. If Iran still retains the majority of its missile arsenal, is Trump's messaging unduly optimistic?
Well, that would be part of it. According to the White House and other sources, they say that they have removed 90% of the ballistic missile and drone capability.
I don't believe anything the White House says.
But Iran has not capitulated. So,
not only that,
has the U.S. secured a total victory?
I mean,
the Navy, the 150 ships are at the bottom of the ocean. There is no Air Force in Iran anymore. No one has ever done this before to Iran, stating the obvious. And again, this was the world's leading terrorist actor.
I mean, that
for
is
47
one thing
years.
that people have been saying, is that Iran is an issue, is a country, and the
they're bad guys.
Nuclear issue
But
is
there are
something
many
the
bad
previous
guys.
presidents have never tackled before.
Because we didn't need to. Let me
They
be clear
are
about
among-
something. Iran was never a direct threat to the United States of America. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, look, as it relates to the way that we got in, that is what it is. But if Trump wants to get us out of here, he has to be nice to our allies and sit down with them and have a conversation and say, hey, listen, I'm sorry that I went in and didn't include you in the conversation, but can we figure out some way? He's not done that. He spent a year and a half bullying them, right? And now he's saying, well, now you need to come in and help me, without apologizing and trying to fix the thing. I mean, this is not even a partisan conversation from my view right now. It's a conversation about our global affairs and our relationships abroad and how we're going to manage those.
Thousands of Americans have been killed by Iran. Iran started their course in 1979 when they took American hostages. The Beirut bombing that killed hundreds of soldiers.
Yeah, but we can go back to 1953
They've been funding,
and talk about how this all started.
Yeah, but this is the.
We can't start 30, 40 years ago.
They've
Let's
been
go back
funding
further.
proxy wars
They've been
in
funding
East
all this
and-
stuff, but they're not getting nukes over in
They didn't
Africa.
have nukes.
They're not getting.
And by the way, that's
they're
how
not,
Barack Obama delivered the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to prevent that from happening. Donald Trump withdrew from that. He withdrew from TPP. He withdrew from all of these things that created
Well,
global
because he
stability.
believes now he's going to get a better deal.
And he's delivered nothing on either one of those.
Americans elected him to deliver deals.
Is there a split within the Republican Party between the MAGA loyalists and more moderate Republicans over the war?
Look, I think there's whenever you get into a war, there's always disagreements. I remember the Iraq War under George W. Bush. There was lots of whispering, but it was interesting because at that time it was almost unanimous support on the Republican side. The neocon universe in the Republican Party is much smaller now. And so certainly when President Trump is conducting a war, that is less appreciated for some members of the base.
You think that you're going to win big time in the midterms?
Massive win in the House, double digits. The Senate's going to be close, but even if Republicans hold on in the Senate, the margin will be so close. They'll be limited in terms of what they can do.
Will the Democrats move to impeach the president if they flip both the House and the Senate?
I think there's so many impeachable offenses, it will be hard not to do so.
Patrick, can Republicans withstand this?
It is just extremely difficult for the Democrats to take the Senate. The House, that could be more likely, but the Republican Party is putting themselves in a good stance, good positioning with fundraising and messaging to hopefully capitalize on President Trump's success.
All right, thank you. Interesting times. Great to chat with you both. Great conversation. Well, we started this conversation in Washington, where war decisions are made, but next we're going to Annapolis, Maryland, where many officers in the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps are trained before going out to sea. Retired Vice Admiral John Miller is currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Middle East Institute. I sat down with him to look at the Strait of Hormuz through a former commander's eye.
I think the blockade has been very effective, and it is having the desired intended effect to it. We've deterred, as we would expect, a number of vessels from trying to get into the Gulf to get to an Iranian port or to get out of the Gulf.
Iran, despite being militarily inferior, has waged this very unconventional war in the Strait of Hormuz, using low-cost drones, the threat of undersea mines, blockading the Strait of Hormuz. How effective have those tactics been?
In the force-on-force fight, we've been very, very successful.
But Iran has also been successful.
They've been successful in the fight they've always wanted to have, which is this asymmetric fight. And so if you look at where the drones have been successful, some success against civilian infrastructure, so oil refineries, desalination plants, some success against other civilian targets. But if you look at what they've launched, both missiles and drones, they only have about a 5% effective rate. But if that ends up in the middle of a refinery, at one of these very unique desalination plants, in the middle of an apartment complex, it certainly has an impact to it. We know they have mines, they've had mines. We know we knew where their mines were stored. And so do we have all of those mines? It's hard to know. Iran has said they put mines in the Strait. Not really a great place to mine. I'm not sure that's entirely true. We haven't found any yet. No one's run into one.
We were talking about the asymmetric warfare that is being waged there. They're having quite a lot of success with these smaller vessels.
If we go back to the beginning of the conflict, Iran almost immediately, in fact, really within hours, declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. And then they went and attacked ships, and they didn't do it with their Navy. They didn't do it with an Air Force. They went on these small boats, fast attack crafts, so speedboats, if you will, but with relatively little effort and with relatively little violence, they closed the strait because the insurance companies immediately said, this isn't safe. We're not going to go through the strait until it is safe. So with relatively light military power, they've had this large strategic effect on the global economy.
You mentioned the strikes on the Gulf countries. Were you surprised by the strikes, not just on the US bases that are housed in some of these Gulf countries, but also on the civilian infrastructure, on the energy infrastructure? Did that come as a surprise?
It did, to be honest with you. We knew that where US military concentrations were, so most of the time these are bases that belong to these countries that allow us access to these bases. We knew those were always a potential target of the Iranians. And we knew it would be ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones. None of that's a surprise. I have been surprised by their willingness of the regime to attack civilian targets.
Do you think the White House or this administration has underestimated the Iranian capabilities to completely blockade the strait?
I think that we, because of the way the plan was executed and the concentration early on leadership, on infrastructure, on storage sites, on nuclear facilities, I think that naturally gave, via the plan, the regime an opportunity to close the strait. Credit to them, they took advantage of that opportunity, and they've managed to keep it closed.
And does this set a global precedent now for, if we look at the Strait of Malacca, if we look at the South China Sea or the Red Sea now, other countries could feasibly blockade a strait and cause huge economic global impact?
There are a number of choke points in the world that are international straits. There are others like Suez and Panama that are very important straits that are in the hands of a country. But we rely on these countries that border on these international straits or these critical pieces of maritime choke points. We rely on them to behave in an orderly fashion in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which has been in effect for over 3 decades. If we accept tolls in Hormuz, then we're by definition willing to accept tolls for ships to sail in the South China Sea and to abide by the rules that the Chinese set. We can't allow that to happen.
Do you worry about the risk of escalation in this conflict?
One of the questions that people asked, and it's a valid question, is, okay, what happens if a Chinese flagged vessel wants to go into port, to an Iranian port? Well, for the blockade to be legal, we have to turn that ship away. What happens if it's a Chinese flagged vessel that's escorted by a Chinese warship? There's the opportunity for escalation. I don't think the Chinese are interested in that escalation. We certainly are not.
I mean, there's a lot of assets in the region. Is it taking away resources from other theaters around the world? I'm thinking of the Indo-Pacific specifically.
There are only so many ships to go around, and some ships are in maintenance, some ships are in training, some ships are on deployment, some ships have just come home. So we only have so much of everything. We only have so many weapons. Do those weapons flow intra-theater, from theater to theater during a conflict? Certainly. So it does take away, at least on a temporary basis. That doesn't mean we still have a carrier strike group in the Pacific. We're still engaged in the Pacific and will remain engaged in the Pacific. So we understand our global responsibilities. We could use a bigger Navy. You hear a lot of discussion about that. It's true.
Well, you're an ex-Navy man, you would say that.
Right, because it's true. But we do need a bigger Navy in order to be able to be more flexible for these kinds of activities.
Did Iran pose an imminent threat to the United States?
Iran has posed a constant threat to the United States. And you can go back to the very beginning of the regime 47 years ago.
But did it pose an imminent threat?
It's a constant threat. They're not coming, they're already here. So they've already been, and they have been for decades, attacking U.S. interest, U.S. personnel. Take the Beirut bombings, the embassy bombing, the bombing of the Beirut barracks, the Marines.
But the U.S. wasn't under immediate attack.
We've been under attack from the regime since the beginning. And they do, there's...
So you think that this war was justified?
Oh, I do. I definitely do. There was always going to have to be a military solution to the regime's willingness and ability to project malign power outside of its borders.
And you think the preemptive strikes were justified?
I do.
Admiral, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to Inside America.
Thanks for having me.
A candid conversation there with the retired Vice Admiral. Whether Iran did or did not pose an imminent threat to the United States will continue to be debated as the cost of this war continues to be felt here in the US. That's it from us. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Inside America.